Going back to the 1970s, which was the time I came back to Nigeria around 1972. And during the 1970s, there were a number of concerts, ad hoc concerts organized. But these were on a random basis. It wasn't until 1979 when a British High Commissioner, Sir Mervyn Brown, was posted to Lagos that things really started moving. He was a keen clarinetist and pianist, and one of the things he enjoyed doing was to organize concerts in his residence. He would give a dinner party, and at the end of the dinner, he would perform, and he targeted the trained musicians in Lagos to take part in the concerts. And amongst these trained musicians were Mrs. Francesca Emanuel, who was a very fine soprano singer. She was the first lady permanent secretary in the Nigerian Civil Service, and myself as a pianist. And Sir Mervyn gave these concerts on a pretty regular basis. And amongst the people who attended from time to time was Mr. Akintola Williams and his wife, Oye Williams. Now, when Sir Mervyn was eventually leaving Nigeria on retirement, Mr. and Mrs. Williams gave a dinner party in his honor in the house. And amongst the guests were my wife and I. And at the end of the dinner, Mr. Williams was seeing us off to the door. And I turned to him and I said, Mr. Williams, we ought to have a musical society to continue what Sir Mervyn has been doing. Because we have the performers, you have a list of invitees that he invites to his concerts. It's something we should think about. And I mentioned to him I'd already discussed the matter with Chief Rasheed Gbadamosi, who was a friend of mine, and Mrs. Francesca Emanuel. And both of them were enthusiastic. He said, good, I'll call you. So the very next morning, he phoned me. He said, Louis, I've been thinking about what you said, and I'd like us to meet. What do you do on Sunday morning? I said, well, after church, I'm free. He said, can you come to my house? I said, certainly. So late on Sunday morning, I went to his house. And he invited me into his study. I sat on an armchair. He sat at his desk. And for the next 2 hours, we brainstormed. He was asking questions, how do you envisage the society? And I gave him the legal framework that I had in mind under the Land Perpetual Succession Act and so on. Then we discussed about the people to take part in the society. And immediately I mentioned Chief Rasheed Gbadamosi and Francesca Emanuel. He mentioned Chief Ayo Rosiji, who he said was at school with him and was keen on music. We started compiling a list of invitees to form a steering committee. And so at the end of our meeting, we already had the framework, the legal framework, the logistics and so on of a musical society. Mr. Williams, at that time, had just retired from his practice, his firm, Akintola Williams & Co., which is one of the premier chartered accountancy firms in Lagos. And he was a man full of energy and full of enterprise. And I think he saw this as an exciting project for his retirement. In due course, within the next few days, he sent out invitations to the names we had mentioned, inviting them to a meeting of a steering committee in his house. And that steering committee then metamorphosed into the Board of Trustees. I should say that right from day one, his house became the secretariat of the society, and his secretary was the secretary of the society. Mrs. Williams always came into our meetings to bring us refreshments. And after some time, after a few meetings, she came and sat down and became a part of the exercise. And thereafter, she played a very, very major role, together with her husband, in the physical aspects of the society, the planning, all the many organizational aspects. Well, in the course of time, we then had to start giving concerts. And the first concert was about 3 months or so after our meeting started. It was held on the 21st of February, 1984, which happened to be the birthday of our first chairman, Chief Ayo Rosiji. I would mention that Chief Rosiji, to those who don't know him, was a minister in the First Republic. He was Minister of Health, I think. And by this stage, he was retired, but he was in business, a very successful businessman, and he was a lawyer by training. So we agreed that he should be the first chairman of the society. And he was chairman for about 3 years. And then after him, Mr. Williams took over as chairman, and I became the vice chairman. And I continued as vice chairman. He was chairman for 8 years. And eventually, in 1995, I succeeded him as chairman of the society and was there for about 6 years before I retired. Let me start listing the people concerned. I've mentioned Mr. Akintola Williams already, very distinguished accountant. And Chief Ayo Rosiji, I've mentioned already, politician and successful businessman. And Mrs. Francesca Emanuel, I've mentioned, she was the First Lady Permanent Secretary and a very, very important member of society. Then there was Chief Rasheed Gbadamosi, who had been a minister both at state and federal level. And he was a playwright and a lover of the arts and a friend of mine. Then I myself was then the youngest member of the group. I was at the height of my legal practice, and barely 4 years after MUSON was formed, I became a senior advocate of Nigeria. There were a number of other people. Let me mention the Nigerians. There was Chief Femi Adeniyi Williams, who was an advertising guru. There was Basharun Jai Randall, a chartered accountant. There was Mrs. Olga Miller, who was the sister of the famous Steve Rhodes, and she was a singer and musician in her own right. And there was Mrs. Otto Lijadu, who was a former teacher, but very interested in music. So those are the Nigerians who actually took part. There were a number of expatriates. I mentioned, for example, Walter Haag, who was the Austrian ambassador. He had a very fine tenor voice. He was quite active. There was Helen Travers, who was an English, she was a housewife, but she was a trained opera singer. Then there was Eileen Barnard, who was a pianist. There was Sharon Grato, who was an American flautist. She was the wife of somebody in the American embassy. There was an Indian called Ranji David, who had a very fine tenor voice. So those are the musicians who formed the initial group. Then, of course, at that time, the embassies were all in Lagos. And a number of ambassadors were very supportive. There was at that time the Italian Cultural Institute. There's the German Goethe Institute, the British Council. They all provided, from time to time, concerts and musicians and so on. So you could see that we had a pool of people who have made it in their professions, and everybody lived within Victoria Island, Ikoyi. So it was a sort of an elitist clique, you might say. In those days, of course, Lagos was a safer place, so going out in the evenings was not such a problem as it is today. So when eventually we got going, invitations were sent to people who were the cultured community of Lagos, and they came in numbers. So it became a very popular event. within the Lagos community. The other thing I would mention is that most of the major companies were run by expatriates, most of whom were also interested in music. And they attended our concerts. So you could see that it was a unique period of time. You cannot, in today's Nigeria, assemble such a group of people. Well, let me go back a little bit because the first concerts we had for the first 10 years were held at the Metropolitan Club in Victoria Island. And in the course of time, the Board of Trustees decided that we had to get our own concert venue. And we thought, well, let us apply to Lagos State government for some land where we could build our center. And so delegations led by Mr. Akintola Williams and Chief Ayo Rosiji went to the governor of Lagos State, who at that time was Admiral Mike Akhigbe. And he was very receptive and made one or two offers, the most interesting of which was what was known as the Love Garden in Oniko, which is opposite the museum. This is a 3.5-acre site. And in colonial times, it was a nice garden where people went to relax, but it had become disused, and there were all kinds of junkies and people occupying the place. So the governor offered us this land with the proviso that it was to be used for tourism in Lagos State. So we said, well, okay, I mean, music is part of tourism. People come to listen to concerts and so on. And that was how we came to occupy that site. We then instructed engineers, architects. There's Robin Johnston, who was the chief executive of Design Group Architects, an Englishman. So he came for several meetings with the Board of Trustees and showed us various possible designs of concert venues. And when we eventually agreed, he then started his drawings. And ultimately, when the drawings were ready, we then launched an appeal for funds. And around that time, we had to do a ground breaking and foundation laying ceremony. And it so happened that Prince Charles was visiting Nigeria around that time. And so Mr. Williams thought, well, let us invite him to come and lay the foundation stone, which he did. There's a nice ceremony in which the foundation stone was laid, speeches were made, refreshments were provided. And that was really how the center started. And in the course of time, appeals were sent out, and all the major companies contributed in cash or in kind. One of the objects of the society, the objects of the MUSON are to promote the enjoyment and understanding of classical music. And we thought that the best way to approach this is to educate, especially children, but adults as well, in the performance of music and so on. So Mr. James Adekunle, who was a retired music teacher at King's College, Lagos, was asked to set up a basic school of music. And this he organized at Corona School in Ikoyi. So children were going there for lessons. And this became gradually an important feature of the society. But it wasn't until, actually it was 2006, that the federal government gave us the permit to set up a school, a diploma school of music. And luckily at that time, Mrs. Marian Akpata, who was an American married to a Nigerian and a trained pianist and musicologist, became the director of the MUSON school. And she approached the MTN Foundation, which at that time had as its executive director Ms. Noni Ubuma, and the two got on very well, and they both had the same sort of vision. And it was then agreed that MTNF would provide funding for the school. And they did this by providing subsidies to the students, provided money for books, money for tuition, money for upkeep and so on. And the school really got on the ground in 2008, when the first intake of 30 students came on board. And since then, it's been going from strength to strength. We now have about 350 graduates of the school. It's a 2-year course. And in order to enter the school, they have to have attained quite a standard already in performance and theory. But after 2 years of intensive training, they achieve incredible heights. And a number of them go on to universities in Europe, America, Britain, South Africa, to continue their musical education. And there have been a number who have really hit the major heights. The musical side of MUSON was run by the Artists Committee, of which I was chairman. Mrs. Francesca Emanuel was vice chairman. And a number of musicians, some of the expatriates and so on, were also members of the committee. And around 1996, we resolved that a choir should be set up. Now, one of the members of the committee was Emeka Nwokedi, who was a graduate of Nsukka University, and a real expert in choral music. So we gave a mandate that he and Mrs. Emanuel should set up a choir. So Emeka, with his connections, and Francesca, with her administrative abilities, set up this choir. And within a few years, the thing had taken off in a very big way. And before we knew it, they were winning prizes in Europe, in competitions. And at one stage they toured China and caused quite a stir in China. Regarding the orchestra, that had a slower beginning. Around 1998, 97, there was a British violinist called Louise Jones, whom I'd met in London, and I'd invited her to be coming to MUSON. She would come, spend a couple of weeks, and go back. And all the string players gathered around her. She was giving them lessons. And at a certain stage, she said to me, look, we ought to form a chamber orchestra. We have enough musicians. And so that was done. And the very first orchestral concerts in MUSON were given under the direction of Louise Jones and the group of string players. Well, after Louise Jones left around 2001, she stopped coming, there was a hiatus. And eventually around 2005, there was a chap called Paul Conye, who was a violinist. And funnily enough, he took part in the very first of the MUSON concerts and played there. After that, he'd gone to America, sponsored by some of the MUSON people. And he had graduated in America and become a conductor. So he came back and set up the MUSON Symphony Orchestra. And he was there for a couple of years and then went back to America. So since then, the orchestra has been conducted by a number of people. There's Thomas Kanitz, who was a German who became artistic director of MUSON. He conducted the orchestra for some years. But in the last 6 or 7 years, a conversation I held over the phone with a German conductor, Walter Michael Volhardt, led to his coming to Nigeria about 3 or 4 times a year to train and conduct our orchestra. And each time he comes, the orchestral players get together and they work hard and give a concert. And the last performance was during the recent MUSON Festival, where they performed quite a substantial program. So that's been a major achievement. I would also mention the opera group. There's a certain Joe Oparamanuike who started life in MUSON and then went to Edinburgh, to Scotland, to the Alexander Gibson School of Opera, and learned the art of opera production. Now, he was a very fine tenor singer. And after he graduated, he came back to Nigeria and came to MUSON. And he tried to set up his own opera group. But I met with him. I said, look, you need the MUSON infrastructure to be able to advance your group. So why don't you come into MUSON? We'll appoint you director of opera, and then we'll give you all the facilities to put on operatic performances. He accepted to do so. And I'm happy to say that they achieved incredible performances of some of the major operas. And in due course, Lieutenant General Danjuma, who heard them sing, was so enthralled that he offered to fund the opera department, and he has been doing so hitherto. The very first concert was held on the 24th of February, 1984. And it was a concert, I think about half a dozen of us performed. There were a couple of English pianists who took part. I think one was Jonathan Hawley, another one was Chris Bowman. Then there's Francesca Emanuel. There was Ranji David, the Indian tenor. He was then managing director of Tower Aluminium. There was Helen Travers, and there was Walter Haag. And at the very last minute, Paul Connier, asked to take part, and he was brought in and he played a piece accompanied by the late Richard Bucknell. So the concert took place in the Metropolitan Club, and the late Dr. Majekodumi was chairman of the occasion. And Mr. and Mrs. Williams were very, very active in inviting all the movers and shakers, as it were. And they came to this concert, which was a great success. NTA was there, and they recorded the concert. Parts of it were broadcast later. Then thereafter, we started giving concerts about every couple of months. And the concerts were given on 2 consecutive nights. We'd have a performance on Friday night and on the Saturday night. And on the Thursday night, we would have a dress rehearsal, and all the performers would get together, listen to each other, make suggestions, and so on. So that by Friday night, the concert took place, and by the Saturday night, it was really at its height. Well, these concerts continued following that same sort of pattern. The embassies would bring sometimes distinguished musicians from their countries. They might perform as soloists or together with some of us, MUSON performers. And so that's how the concerts evolved. When eventually the center was built in 1994, it became a different ball game. We had to increase activities considerably. In the early years, we had a lot more concerts because the embassies were became very much involved, and they were sending us musicians to perform. And the MUSON performers, we gave concerts too from time to time. One of the biggest supporters of our concerts in those days was the Russian embassy. The Russian ambassador at the time, Ambassador Pashin, was a great classical music buff. He and his wife were musicians, and I think their daughter was a concert pianist. So he brought us musicians from Russia. And there was one occasion when they had a group of 6 of them from the Bolshoi Theater, which is a top world-class institution, that came and gave us 3 consecutive nights of concerts. There were also concert pianists from Poland, from Britain, from other countries. And then now, when we then had the choir was now giving a number of concerts. And the orchestra also started giving concerts. So there's a gradual increase in the number of concerts. Yes, well, as I said, it's really the interaction between Marion Akpata, who was the director of the school at the time, and Noni Uboma, who was the executive secretary of MTN Foundation. And so they were looking for educational things to put funding into. And so the MUSON school became something that they were excited about. And so following the various discussions, they now came into the picture. And up till today, they're still giving a very substantial subsidy every year to the students of the school. The major companies in Lagos became enthusiastic about the project. And the major donors were, I think Shell gave us the largest amount, and we therefore decided to name the Shell Hall. Then Ajip gave us a substantial amount, so we named the recital hall the Ajip Hall. Mobile gave us a substantial amount, and we named the Mobile Block, which is the administrative block of MUSON, after Mobile. Then other oil companies, Chevron, for example, has been giving sponsorship, and Total. But apart from the oil companies, all the major, the construction companies contributed in cash or in kind to the project. The list is a very long list of donors. Apart from the various companies, there were a lot of individuals. We created different categories of membership, the highest of which was the benefactor of MUSON. If you donate £1 million, you became a benefactor. And there's a whole list of benefactors. And then, then down to the ordinary member, who paid a fairly small amount to join. But I must say that, at that particular time, the economy was booming, and there were funds available. People were prepared to put money into projects like that. As I said earlier, you cannot set up a MUSON today because the climate is totally different from what it was 30-something years ago. Well, the first challenge, of course, is that of finance. And when we were planning the center, Mr. Williams told the trustees, said, look, we need to make money to run the center. So let us include a multi-purpose hall, which you can rent out for annual general meetings, for parties, and so on and so forth. And we'll raise some revenue so that we can use that to run the society. So that eventually gave rise to the Shell Hall. And it was it became a major source of funding for us. Shell also was very, very generous, because when I was chairman way back in 1995, I approached the MD of Shell, and I met with him and told him that we planned to bring in expatriate musicians and wanted to buy some more musical instruments. And he was very receptive, and at the end he said, yes, we'll assist you. And within a few days, a check for $150,000 came in. And with this, we were able to bring in artists in residence from foreign countries. We had a Russian lady, a Hungarian cellist, Agnes, and Louise Jones, who was coming from time to time. So that was one of the problems we had, to fund the musicians. In the early years of MUSON, during the first 10 years, none of the performers received 1 kobo for their performances. Everything was done free of charge. But once the center was built, we had to start remunerating people. And that meant that we required more funds. So luckily, so far, we've been able to keep an even keel and be able to fund the concerts. The other problem that we've had, of course, is the audiences, getting the audiences. In the early years, our audiences were, I would say, about 70% expatriates. But in the course of time, most of the expatriates left. Nigeria was no longer as exciting to them as it was. Trying to get Nigerians interested in coming to concerts has been one of our challenges. We have a hard core of supporters, but we're now looking for ways of expanding the audience, going on the internet and so on. Well, I'm a very conservative musician. I go for the Baroque composers, Handel, Bach, and the classical composers in particular, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert. I play a certain amount of the romantic music, Chopin, a little Liszt. But I would say that if you ask me for my real favorite, I'd say it's Beethoven, because somehow, the drama of Beethoven is something that has always appealed to me. A number of the sonatas are performed in MUSON concerts, and it's a challenge which I gladly accept. Yes, well, that is what we have. Essentially, 2 schools of music now. We have the basic school and we have the diploma school. I've spoken about the diploma school, but the basic school, which was started by Mr. Adekunle, is still there. And young people, anybody can go and enroll. If you want to play any instrument, you want to play the trumpet, you go to the school. They'll assign a teacher to you, and you have your lesson on a regular basis. So that's a way of encouraging the young people to learn music. But when you talk of popular music, my belief is that if you're going to be a musician, then you have to learn the basics. You have to learn how to read music, and you have to practice an instrument to a very acceptable degree. So as far as I'm concerned, the starting point should be the training in classical music, because that gives you the foundation. A number of the students at the School of Music have displayed their considerable talents in areas other than classical music, in jazz, for example, in popular music. One of the great legacies of MUSON is that we've created a whole cadre of musicians who previously would not have had the exposure or the training. Now, if you go to any wedding or social event, they have a group of performers who most of them were trained in MUSON, and very, very high standard of performances. So if you go to a concert given by the MUSON School, you'll find different types of music being performed there, And the students are very skilled in all the different types of music. But as I say, MUSON is fundamentally on classical music, which is a very, very important start to any musical aspiration. Well, the Society's plans are basically to continue on the path we've set out. When I was chairman in 1995, between 1995 and 2001, I decided that we need to broaden MUSON beyond classical music. And my vision is that MUSON should become a center for all the arts. And so I instituted the festival, the MUSON Festival, which is a festival, you have a 2-week festival or 10-day festival in which you have classical music, you have jazz, you have traditional music and dance, you have drama, you have art exhibitions, so all the arts will be featured. And my belief is that people who practice these arts should find a home in MUSON, should be able to come there. You target some key individuals who can coordinate these things and make it all part of MUSON. But as I said, our main focus is classical music, but we want to go beyond classical music into a real art center for this part of the world, Nigeria, West Africa, and so on.